David had always prided himself on keeping his property neat and tidy. His lawn was well kept, his house freshly painted, and his driveway free of clutter. It was the kind of home that people admired as they drove by, and David took great satisfaction in the fact that he had worked hard to create a place he could call his own. Peaceful and private, his house by the lake had always felt like the perfect refuge from the busy world. But recently, things had started to change. It began one Saturday morning when David went outside to take his trash cans to the curb. As he walked toward them, he noticed something odd. The trash can was knocked over, its contents spilled all over the driveway. At first, he thought it might have been an accident or perhaps a stray animal. But as he looked around, he noticed something more unusual. There was a note stuck to the side of the can. It was from Karen, his neighbor, who happened to be one of the most vocal members of the Homeowners Association, HOA. The note was simple, but the message was clear: your trash is unsightly. Please keep it inside your garage. This is a neighborhood, not a landfill. David was taken aback. He hadn't seen Karen in person for a while, but her note was direct and judgmental. He hadn't even noticed his trash being a problem before. Sure, it wasn't the tidiest thing to have the cans sitting outside, but wasn't it common for people to put their trash out? Everyone had to take out their garbage, didn't they? At first, David shrugged it off. Maybe Karen was just having a bad day, he thought. He cleaned up the mess and moved the cans behind the garage. It seemed like a small request, and he didn't want to cause trouble with his neighbors, so he complied. But the next week, it happened again. This time, the trash can wasn't just knocked over. It was pushed all the way to the front of the driveway. David had to wonder how it had gotten there. He checked the security camera footage and, to his surprise, saw Karen walking by early in the morning. She stopped at his trash can, looked around, and then pushed it out into the open before walking away with a smirk on her face. David couldn't believe it. His first thought was that maybe she had just bumped into it by accident, but when he replayed the footage, he saw her deliberately move it. She was doing this on purpose. The next day, he found another note from her. It was shorter this time but still filled with criticism. The trash looks worse every week. Please take better care of your property. He couldn't take it anymore. David was frustrated. What right did she have to come onto his property and treat him like he was some kind of troublemaker? He hadn't done anything wrong. He had simply put out his trash like everyone else. But now it felt like Karen was trying to make him feel guilty for something that wasn't even an issue. David decided he would confront her. He knew that she had been a part of the HOA for years, and he had heard from a few neighbors that she was one of the more controlling members. But he hadn't thought much of it until now. The HOA was supposed to be there to help maintain the neighborhood, but from what David had seen, it seemed more like they were focused on making unnecessary rules and bullying their neighbors into submission. One afternoon, when Karen was walking her dog past his house, David decided it was time to speak up. He stepped outside, walking toward her with a forced calmness. "Hey, Karen," he said, trying to keep his voice friendly. "I've been meaning to talk to you about something." She stopped and turned to him, giving him a polite but somewhat disinterested smile. "Oh, David. What's going on?" "About the trash," David said, trying to keep his tone even. "I've noticed the cans being knocked over a few times, and I've found some notes from you. I just wanted to ask, why are you moving my trash cans?" Karen's smile faded just a little, and she shifted her weight from one foot to the other. "Well," she said with a sigh, "your trash was just sitting out in front of your house, looking unsightly. It doesn't reflect well on the neighborhood, and the HOA doesn't allow that sort of thing." David blinked, confused. The HOA doesn't allow trash to be left out? Since when? Karen didn't look him in the eye. "It's a matter of neighborhood standards," she said, brushing off his question. "We want to keep the area looking nice. You should really keep your trash in the garage or out of sight until the pickup day." David couldn't believe it. He had lived in several neighborhoods, and he had never heard of such a strange rule. "I didn't realize my trash was such a big issue," he said, trying to keep his frustration in check. "I thought it was just part of living in a neighborhood." Karen raised her eyebrows, acting like she had the upper hand. "Well, it's not. The HOA keeps things in order, and you need to follow the guidelines. If you don't, there will be consequences. David's patience was wearing thin. He could feel the tension building between them. Look, I get that you want things to look nice, but this is my property. You don't have the right to come onto my land and move my things. Karen raised her chin slightly, clearly annoyed that he was questioning her authority. I'm just doing my job, she said, her voice sharper now. The HOA expects everyone to keep the neighborhood up to standard. And if you don't start doing your part, I'll have to report this. David could feel the anger rising in him, but he took a deep breath. I'll take care of it, he said, forcing a calm tone. But I expect you to stop moving my trash. This is my property, Karen. Respect that. Karen gave him a dismissive nod before turning and walking away with her dog. David stood there, his fists clenched at his sides. He couldn't believe how bold she had been. Who did she think she was, acting like she could control his life? As David watched her walk off, he realized something important. This wasn't just about trash cans. It was about control. Karen was trying to push him around, and if he let her, she wouldn't stop. David wasn't going to back down. He wasn't going to let her, or the HOA, take control of his property. This was just the beginning. The day after his confrontation with Karen, David felt a mix of anger and determination. He had never thought much about the homeowners association before, but after the way Karen had treated him, he was beginning to see just how controlling they were. She had made it clear that they were all about enforcing their rules, no matter how ridiculous they might seem. It wasn't just about keeping the neighborhood nice. It was about power. And Karen had made it her mission to remind him that she, and the HOA, had the final say in everything. David wasn't the type to back down easily. He didn't mind following reasonable rules. But this was a blatant overstep. He'd moved into the house to enjoy peace, not to have someone tell him how to manage his own trash. The more he thought about it, the more frustrated he became. He wasn't going to let Karen, or anyone else, tell him how to live his life. That night, David sat down with a cup of coffee, scrolling through the neighborhood's community guidelines, hoping to find some rule that could justify Karen's behavior. He hadn't really paid attention to the HOA's guidelines when he moved in. Like most people, he assumed they were just about basic things, keeping lawns neat, managing common areas, and that sort of thing. He didn't think there would be anything in there about trash cans being unsightly. To his surprise, there was nothing specific in the guidelines about trash placement. Sure, there were rules about maintaining the exterior of homes, but nothing about when or where people could leave their trash out. It was clear that Karen had taken matters into her own hands. But David wasn't ready to let her get away with it. He was going to find a way to fight back, but he had to do it carefully. If he confronted Karen again too soon, it would only escalate things. David decided to take a different approach. He wasn't going to let her think she could control his property without consequences. The next morning, he went to the hardware store and bought a few items. He didn't just want to move his trash cans behind the garage, out of sight. He wanted to send a message. Later that afternoon, he spent a few hours installing a motion-activated alarm system near his trash cans. It wasn't dangerous, just a loud, irritating noise that would go off if anyone moved or tampered with his cans. He set the alarm to be triggered by the slightest motion. If Karen, or anyone else, decided to knock over his trash again, they would get an earful. He smiled at the thought of her surprise when the alarm went off. The next day, David waited. He knew that Karen was likely to come by, either to check on his trash again or simply to continue with her routine. He sat in his living room, watching through the window, waiting for the right moment. His heart raced with excitement. This wasn't just about trash anymore. It was about showing Karen that he wouldn't be bullied. Sure enough, around midday, Karen walked past his house with her dog. As she passed the driveway, she glanced at the trash cans, her eyes narrowing. David could tell she was already thinking of ways to make trouble. She walked slowly, looking as if she was deciding when the best time would be to move his cans again. Just as she reached for the handle of his trash can, the motion sensor went off. The loud, piercing noise shattered the quiet afternoon, causing Karen to jump back in surprise. David watched through the window as she looked around in confusion, trying to figure out what had just happened. Her eyes darted around, scanning for the source of the noise. David couldn't help but grin. He'd set the trap perfectly. He kept watching as Karen took a few cautious steps back, clearly unsure of what to do next. She seemed to realize she had triggered something, but she wasn't sure what. The alarm continued blaring for a few moments before it finally stopped. Karen took a deep breath, still looking around, before muttering something under her breath and walking away quickly. David couldn't believe how easily it had worked. His heart was pounding from the thrill of it all. He had finally found a way to stand up to Karen without directly confronting her. It was a small victory, but it felt like a huge one. The message had been sent. He wasn't going to be her target anymore. Later that afternoon, Karen came back, but this time, she didn't go near the trash cans. Instead, she seemed to give David's house a wide berth, walking quickly past his driveway with her dog, as if trying to avoid any further trouble. David watched from the window, feeling a surge of satisfaction. He had done it. Karen hadn't just backed off from the trash cans. She was clearly rattled. She had thought she could control him, but now she knew better. The following days passed without incident. Karen didn't knock over his trash again, and there were no more notes. But David knew this wasn't over. Karen was part of the HOA, and she wouldn't just let this slide. She would find a way to retaliate, but David was ready. If she thought she could intimidate him, she was in for a rude awakening. The game had changed, and now David was the one in control. The HOA might have had the power to make rules, but they couldn't control him. Not anymore. The following days felt oddly quiet. Karen, as expected, didn't approach David about the trash cans, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. The motion alarm had worked perfectly, and for once, it felt like he had the upper hand. But David knew better than to get too comfortable. Karen was part of the HOA, and from what he had seen, the HOA wasn't the type to let things go easily. He had no doubt that she would try to retaliate in some way. That evening, as David sat down to relax, he heard a knock on his door. His heart skipped a beat. Who could it be? He wasn't expecting any visitors. He opened the door, and to his surprise, it was one of his neighbors, Mrs. Andrews, an older woman who had lived in the neighborhood for years. She looked around cautiously before speaking. "David, I need to talk to you about something," she said in a hushed voice. "It's about Karen." David raised an eyebrow. "Karen? What about her?" Mrs. Andrews glanced around nervously before lowering her voice even more. "I don't want to get involved, but I think you should know. She's been talking about you to the other HOA members. She's not happy about what happened with the trash can." David felt a small wave of concern wash over him. He had known retaliation was coming, but hearing it from another neighbor made it feel more real. "What's she saying?" "She's saying that you're causing trouble, David. She's telling the HOA that you're refusing to follow the community rules and making a scene over something as simple as trash. She's pushing for the HOA to fine you or take further action. She's been telling everyone you're a troublemaker." David's jaw tightened. He had expected this, but hearing the details made him angry. How dare Karen twist the truth like that? He wasn't causing trouble. He was standing up for himself after being pushed around by her. And now, she was trying to turn the tables on him, painting him as the bad guy. "I see," David said, his voice calm but firm. "Thanks for letting me know, Mrs. Andrews." She gave him a concerned look. "I just want to make sure you're aware. The HOA isn't known for being lenient, and if Karen has her way, this could escalate quickly." David nodded, appreciating her warning. He knew he couldn't just sit back and let Karen make him the villain. If she wanted a fight, she was going to get one. But this time, it would be on his terms. After Mrs. Andrews left, David spent the rest of the evening thinking about his next move. He wasn't about to let Karen manipulate the situation. He had to gather more support. He needed to find out who else in the neighborhood was tired of Karen's antics and the HOA's control. If the HOA wanted to make him the target, he would make sure they knew they couldn't do whatever they wanted without consequences. The next morning, David decided to go around and talk to a few more of his neighbors. He wasn't looking for trouble, but he knew he couldn't let Karen continue to spread lies about him. He knocked on the doors of a few houses and, when he found people willing to talk, he asked about their experiences with the HOA. It didn't take long for David to realize that Karen wasn't the only one making life difficult for the residents. Several neighbors, like Mrs. Andrews, had been quietly dealing with the HOA's heavy-handed tactics for years. From minor fines to absurd demands, the HOA had made many people feel like prisoners in their own homes. David quickly learned that people were just too scared to speak out. They didn't want to risk upsetting the HOA or facing retaliation, even though they were unhappy with the way things were being run. One neighbor, Steve, told David about an incident where he had been fined because the HOA didn't approve of the way he trimmed his hedges. Another neighbor, Linda, mentioned how she had been told to repaint her house because it didn't match the approved color scheme, even though the house had been the same color for years. It was clear to David that the HOA wasn't just trying to enforce a few rules. They were using fear and intimidation to control everyone. And it wasn't just Karen. The entire HOA had become a system of power and manipulation, taking advantage of people who were too afraid to stand up to them. David made a decision then. He couldn't back down now. If he was going to expose the HOA for what they really were, he needed to bring people together. It was time to take action, and he wasn't going to do it alone. That night, David sat down with his laptop and began drafting a letter. He knew he needed to make his case clear and concise. He wrote about his experiences, about the overreach of the HOA, and about the unfair tactics they had been using to control the neighborhood. But he didn't stop there. He also wrote about how they could fight back, how they could come together and make their voices heard. David sent the letter to every neighbor he had spoken with, asking them to join him in standing up to the HOA. He knew that it wouldn't be easy, but if enough people came together, they could force the HOA to listen. They could make a change. The next morning, David received several responses. People were willing to help, but they were still afraid. Some were worried about the consequences if the HOA found out. Others were unsure if they could actually make a difference. But David wasn't discouraged. He had seen the truth, and he knew that if they worked together, they could take down the HOA. As the days passed, more neighbors reached out, offering their support. Slowly but surely, David was gathering a group of like-minded people, all of whom were ready to stand up for their rights. But he knew this was just the beginning. The battle with the HOA wouldn't be easy, but it was a fight worth having. And David was ready for whatever came next. The days following David's decision to fight back against the HOA felt like a whirlwind. The letters he had sent out had brought a mix of responses. Some neighbors were hesitant, others were outright scared, but there were also a few who were eager to join him. David knew that this wasn't just about one trash can or one neighbor's complaints. It was about changing the way the HOA controlled the neighborhood. And he couldn't do it alone. One afternoon, he met with a few of the neighbors who had agreed to support him. They gathered at his house, sitting around his kitchen table, and David could see the mixture of nervousness and determination in their eyes. He knew that it was going to take time, but if they were going to stand up to the HOA, they had to start somewhere. "I know this isn't easy," David began, his voice steady. "But we've all been living under the HOA's thumb for too long. They've made us feel small, like we have no say in what happens in our own neighborhood. It's time we take our power back." Lisa, a woman in her 40s who had lived in the neighborhood for over 15 years, was the first to speak up. "I'm with you, David. But we need to be careful. Karen's not just some neighbor. She's a part of the HOA, and they've been in control for years. If we push back too hard, they'll make sure we regret it." David nodded, understanding her concern. He knew the HOA's power ran deep, but he also knew that fear had kept them in control for so long. "I get it. But if we don't push back now, things will never change. We've all seen how they've treated us, how they've treated you. This isn't about just one person. This is about standing up for all of us." Carl, an older man with a gruff demeanor, added, "David's right. They've been using fear to keep us quiet for years. But if we all speak up, they won't be able to shut us down so easily. We've got to unite, or nothing will change." The others nodded, and David could see the spark of determination in their eyes. They were starting to believe that change was possible. David spent the next few days gathering more support. He knocked on doors, spoke with more neighbors, and shared his plan to confront the HOA. Slowly but surely, more people began to join his cause. Some were hesitant, still afraid of the consequences, but others were ready to fight. The group was small, but it was growing. And with each new person who joined, David felt the strength of their collective resolve. But even with the growing support, David knew they couldn't win this fight by just complaining. They needed hard evidence, something that would force the HOA to listen. So, he began researching the HOA's history, looking for anything that could expose their corruption or abuse of power. He talked to people who had lived in the neighborhood long before he had, hoping they might have information that could help. That's when he discovered something unsettling. Several of the older residents mentioned that the HOA had a history of pushing people out of the neighborhood who didn't fit their idea of acceptable. They had forced people to sell their homes, raised fines to the point where people couldn't afford to stay, and used their influence to manipulate local laws in their favor. The more David learned, the more he realized just how far-reaching the HOA's control had become. One afternoon, David met with Sarah, the lawyer he had consulted earlier, to go over the evidence. She had helped him understand some of the legal aspects of the case, and now, with more information in hand, David felt like they were finally ready to take on the HOA. "We've got enough here to challenge them," Sarah said, looking over the documents David had gathered. "But we need to be strategic. The HOA won't back down easily, and they've got deep pockets. We'll need a solid legal case, not just complaints." David nodded. "I'm ready to fight. I know it's going to be tough, but we can't let them keep doing this to people. They've been using fear and control to manipulate this whole neighborhood." Sarah agreed, but she reminded him that they needed to stay organized and focus on the facts. "We need to show that the HOA is violating legal rights, not just causing trouble. If we can prove that they've overstepped their bounds, it'll be a different story. But we need everyone on board. We'll need people to testify, documents, and as much evidence as we can gather." David spent the next few days working with his neighbors to get everything they needed. They started organizing meetings, gathering signatures, and preparing testimonies from residents who had been affected by the HOA's tactics. Slowly, the group grew stronger, and more people began to speak out about their own experiences with Karen and the HOA. The night before they were scheduled to present their case to the town council, David sat at his kitchen table, looking over the evidence one last time. He was nervous, but he knew this was the moment. The HOA had bullied people for too long, and now, they were about to face the truth. David wasn't sure what would happen next, but he felt a surge of determination. They couldn't let the HOA control them any longer. This was their chance to take back their neighborhood. The following day, the group arrived at the town hall, ready to confront the HOA. Karen was already there, sitting with the other HOA members, a smug look on her face. But David wasn't intimidated. He had his neighbors by his side, and they had the truth on their side. It was time to show the town that the HOA wasn't the unshakable authority they had thought they were. As the meeting began, David stood up, his heart pounding. He wasn't just fighting for his property anymore. He was fighting for the future of the entire neighborhood. The battle had begun. The town hall meeting was packed with residents, many of whom were there to support David and his growing movement. As they waited for the meeting to begin, David could feel the tension in the room. The other members of the HOA, including Karen, sat together, their expressions unreadable. They looked confident, almost smug, as though they believed they had already won. But David wasn't intimidated. He knew this was his chance to expose them for who they truly were. He glanced around the room at the people who had come to support him. His neighbors, people who had been quietly living under the HOA's thumb for years. There was Lisa, Carl, Steve, and several others, their faces a mixture of hope and nervousness. David could tell that this was the moment they had all been waiting for, the moment when they would no longer remain silent. The meeting began, and the town council members introduced the topic of the HOA dispute. Karen stood up first, her usual self-assured demeanor in place. She spoke smoothly, outlining the HOA's concerns about the neighborhood's appearance, the need for rules, and how David had been violating the community guidelines with his trash cans. David clenched his fists as he listened. He knew Karen's words were meant to paint him as the villain, to make him out to be a troublemaker in front of the council. But he wasn't going to let her get away with it. When it was David's turn to speak, he stood up slowly, his heart racing but his mind clear. He looked around the room, at the people who had gathered to hear the truth. He could feel their support behind him, and it gave him the strength to speak out. "Good evening," David began, his voice steady. "I'm David Matthews, and I've come here today because I believe in fairness. I believe in standing up for what's right, and I believe in taking back control of our neighborhood. I've lived here for months now, and during that time, I've seen firsthand how the HOA has been abusing its power, controlling residents and using fear to keep people in line." The room grew quiet. David could sense the tension in the air as people listened to his words. He continued, his voice growing more confident. "Karen and the HOA have made it their mission to dictate how people live, what they can and can't do on their own property, and when we can and can't put out our trash. I'm here today to stand up for every neighbor who has been intimidated, fined, or pushed around by the HOA. We deserve better. We deserve to live in a neighborhood where we're not afraid to speak out or express our concerns." He paused for a moment, letting his words sink in. The council members were paying close attention, some nodding as they listened, while others seemed skeptical. Karen, on the other hand, looked more annoyed than ever, but David wasn't backing down. "I've gathered evidence," David continued, pulling out the documents he had compiled over the past weeks. He placed them on the table for everyone to see. "These are testimonies from neighbors who've been harassed by the HOA. These are records showing how the HOA has overstepped its bounds and manipulated rules to suit their own agenda. And this," David held up a piece of paper, "is the clause in the neighborhood agreement that shows how the HOA has been using its power illegally to control the lake and the docks. They've taken more than just trash cans, they've taken our rights." The room was silent as David laid out the evidence. Some of the neighbors who had come to support him began to whisper among themselves, realizing that what David was saying was true. The HOA had been using fear and intimidation to keep them quiet for too long, and now, the truth was coming out. Karen stood up, her face flushed with anger. "This is outrageous," she shouted, her voice trembling with fury. "David, you are causing a disruption in our community. You've been making up lies to turn everyone against the HOA. This is not how things work around here." David stayed calm, refusing to let Karen's outburst rattle him. "I'm not here to lie, Karen. I'm here to expose the truth. And the truth is that the HOA has been operating in ways that are unfair and illegal. You've been using your position to control people, and I'm done letting you do it." Karen's face was red with anger now, and she seemed to be seething, but she couldn't argue with the evidence David had presented. She sat back down, glaring at him, but David could see the cracks forming in her previously confident facade. One of the council members, a woman named Mrs. Whitaker, spoke up. "David, I have to admit, this is very concerning. If what you're saying is true, then we need to look into the HOA's actions more thoroughly. This isn't something we can ignore." David nodded, relieved that the council was taking him seriously. "Thank you, Mrs. Whitaker. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for fairness. I just want to live in a neighborhood where everyone is treated equally, without fear of being bullied or fined for small mistakes. We all deserve to be heard." The council members exchanged glances, and David could see them beginning to take his side. It was clear that they were starting to question Karen and the HOA's practices. It wasn't over yet, but the tide was turning. After a long discussion, the council decided to table the issue for a few weeks, allowing time for a full investigation into the HOA's practices. They promised to review the evidence David had provided and hold a hearing to discuss the matter further. David's heart soared. This wasn't a victory yet, but it was a huge step in the right direction. As the meeting adjourned, David stood tall, knowing that he had done what was necessary. He had taken the first step in fighting back against the HOA, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came to light. He wasn't going to let Karen or the HOA intimidate him anymore. The battle had just begun, and David was ready to finish it. As he left the town hall, he looked back at his neighbors, who had supported him. They smiled at him, their faces filled with hope. For the first time in a long time, David felt like they were on the verge of something big. He wasn't just standing up for himself anymore. He was standing up for everyone who had been silenced by the HOA. Together, they were going to change the neighborhood. The next few weeks were filled with a sense of anticipation and anxiety. The town council had scheduled the investigation into the HOA's actions, and David felt a mixture of hope and nervousness. He had done everything he could, gathered evidence, rallied his neighbors, and stood up in front of the council. But he knew that this fight was far from over. The HOA, especially Karen, would do everything in their power to maintain their control over the neighborhood. David spent those weeks talking to more neighbors, making sure they were still committed to standing with him. He had seen how powerful fear could be, but he was also starting to see a shift. More and more people were beginning to speak up, realizing that they didn't have to live in silence. David's efforts had sparked something, a sense of unity that had been missing for so long. For the first time, people felt like they had a chance to reclaim their rights. The day of the next council meeting arrived, and David was ready. The community room at Town Hall was packed. There were rows of chairs filled with neighbors, some who had been hesitant to speak up, but now felt empowered to join the fight. David looked around the room, feeling a sense of pride in how far they had come. His neighbors weren't just passive observers anymore. They were active participants in this battle. Karen and the other members of the HOA were seated at the back, as expected. She looked uncomfortably nervous, but she still held her head high, trying to project confidence. David could see that she knew the tide was turning against her, and it made him feel a strange sense of satisfaction. But he couldn't let his guard down. This wasn't over yet. The meeting began, and the council members called everyone to order. Mrs. Whitaker, the council member who had seemed the most sympathetic to David's cause, stood up to speak. "Thank you all for coming today," she began. "We are here to review the actions of the Homeowners Association, following concerns raised by Mr. David Matthews and several other residents. We will be discussing the evidence presented, including complaints of intimidation, unfair fines, and the HOA's overreach in regulating private properties." David felt his pulse quicken. This was it. This was the moment they would finally be heard. He looked around at the faces of his neighbors, who were sitting in anticipation. They were all counting on him to make sure this worked, to expose the HOA for what they truly were. Karen stood up as the council opened the floor for comments. Her usual calm, but stern demeanor was beginning to crack. She looked out at the crowd, then at the council, before speaking in a voice that was slightly shakier than usual. "As we've already stated," Karen said, trying to regain control, "the HOA has only been acting in the best interest of the community. Our purpose is to maintain property values and ensure the neighborhood remains a desirable place to live. Mr. Matthews' actions have caused unnecessary disruption, and it's clear that he's trying to undermine the HOA's authority for his own benefit." David's stomach twisted. She was trying to paint him as the problem, just like before. But he wasn't going to let her manipulate the situation this time. He stood up, ready to respond. "Karen, that's not the truth," David said, his voice calm but firm. "You've been using your position to control this neighborhood and intimidate the residents. You've made people afraid to speak up, and you've imposed unfair fines and rules on people who just want to live peacefully in their homes. This isn't about keeping the neighborhood looking nice, it's about power and control." The room was silent as David's words echoed through the council chamber. He could feel the energy shift. The neighbors around him nodded in agreement, and even some of the council members looked uncomfortable with Karen's defense. David continued, pointing to the documents he had gathered. "Here's the evidence. The fines, the complaints, the harassment. This isn't just about a few trash cans. It's about how the HOA has been abusing its power. I've spoken to residents who are afraid to even leave their homes because of the constant pressure from the HOA. That's not what a community is supposed to be. Mrs. Whittaker stood up, signaling for everyone's attention. "Thank you, Mr. Matthews," she said. "We've reviewed the evidence, and we're hearing from more residents who have been affected by the HOA's actions. It's clear that there is a pattern of behavior here, and we're taking this seriously." Karen's face turned red as she tried to speak, but Mrs. Whittaker raised her hand, silencing her. "Karen, we will allow you to speak shortly, but I want to make it clear that we are not here to allow any further intimidation of our residents. We are here to make sure everyone has a voice." David could see the shift in the room. The council members were no longer just listening to the HOA. They were now listening to him and the people who had come forward with their stories. The power dynamic was changing. As the council continued to review the evidence, David took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. He had done what he came here to do. He had exposed the truth. Now, it was up to the council to make the right decision. After what felt like an eternity, the council reached a decision. Mrs. Whittaker spoke again, her voice steady and authoritative. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing from both sides, the council has decided that a full investigation into the HOA's practices will be conducted. The HOA will be required to revise its community guidelines, and we will hold a public forum to discuss any further concerns. In the meantime, no further fines or penalties can be imposed by the HOA without approval from the council." David felt a rush of relief wash over him. The HOA had been stopped, at least for now. It wasn't a complete victory yet, but it was a huge step forward. His neighbors began to cheer and clap, their voices filled with excitement and relief. David couldn't help but smile. This was the first Real win they had had in a long time. As the meeting adjourned, David looked over at Karen. Her face was pale, and she looked like she was trying to process the defeat. David knew this was far from over, but for now, he had proven that the HOA could be challenged. And that made all the difference. He wasn't alone anymore. And together with his neighbors, David knew they would keep fighting until the HOA was no longer the fearsome power they had once been. The battle had just begun, but the tide had turned in the days following the council's decision. The mood in the neighborhood had shifted. For the first time in a long while, David could see a glimmer of hope in the eyes of his neighbors. The HOA's grip on the neighborhood wasn't as strong as it had once been, and the people were starting to believe that change was possible. There were whispers of support everywhere David went, and even the most hesitant neighbors began to come forward, sharing their stories and standing with him. David knew that this was only the beginning. The HOA, though temporarily halted, was not going to give up so easily. Karen had been quiet since the council meeting, but David could feel that she was just biding her time, waiting for the right moment to strike back. He couldn't let his guard down, not yet. But with every passing day, he felt more confident that they were on the right path. One evening, after a long day of work, David received a call from Mrs. Whittaker, the council member who had been so supportive of his case. Her voice was calm but serious as she spoke. "David," she said, "I'm calling because there's been a development. The HOA has filed an appeal against the council's decision. They're trying to reverse the ruling and restore their control over the neighborhood." David's stomach dropped. He had expected some sort of pushback, but hearing it directly from Mrs. Whittaker made it feel more real. The fight was far from over. "What does that mean?" David asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "It means they're not going to let this go quietly," Mrs. Whittaker replied. "They'll take this to court if necessary. But we'll be prepared. We're going to make sure the investigation into their actions continues, and we'll support you in every step of the way." David clenched his fists. He wasn't about to let Karen and the HOA push him around again. They had made it this far, and he wasn't going to back down now. "Thanks for letting me know, Mrs. Whittaker," David said, his voice firm. "We'll be ready. I'm not giving up." Over the next few days, David reached out to his neighbors, informing them of the HOA's appeal. The news spread quickly, and the support he had gathered only grew stronger. People who had once been afraid to speak out now showed up at his door, ready to help however they could. They knew this wasn't just about trash cans or petty rules anymore. This was about reclaiming their homes, their freedom, and their right to live without fear. But David knew they couldn't win by simply showing up to meetings and voicing their frustrations. They needed a plan, one that would expose the HOA's true nature and force the council to take action. He called a meeting with his core group of supporters, Lisa, Carl, James, and a few others. They gathered in his living room late one night, each of them eager to figure out their next move. "We need to hit them where it hurts," David said, his voice low but determined. "The appeal is just the first step. If we want to make sure they can't bully us anymore, we have to take away their power. We need to expose their corruption, every dirty secret they've been hiding." Lisa nodded. "But we can't just throw accusations around. We need solid evidence. We need something that will make it impossible for the HOA to wiggle out of this." Carl, who had been quiet for most of the meeting, finally spoke up. "I've been talking to a few of the old-timers around here," he said. "There's a lot more going on than people know. The HOA has been pulling strings behind the scenes for years, buying up property, intimidating people, even falsifying documents. If we dig deep enough, we might find something that'll make this whole thing implode." David's heart raced. This was it. The opportunity he had been waiting for. He had known the HOA was corrupt, but hearing it from Carl gave him the confirmation he needed. This fight wasn't just about the trash can anymore. It was about exposing a network of lies and manipulation that had been allowed to thrive for far too long. They decided to focus their efforts on gathering more testimonies from residents who had been harmed by the HOA's actions. David knew that if they could find people who had been forced to leave their homes or had been victimized by unfair fines, it would be hard for the HOA to keep their story straight. The more evidence they gathered, the stronger their case would be. Over the next few weeks, David and his group worked tirelessly. They interviewed residents, dug into property records, and uncovered a disturbing pattern of behavior from the HOA. It became clear that the HOA had been exploiting their position for personal gain, using intimidation and threats to get what they wanted. They had a history of manipulating property values, pressuring people into selling their homes, and imposing fines for the smallest of offenses. With this new evidence in hand, David and his neighbors took their case back to the town council. This time, they were prepared. They had testimonies, documents, and a plan. The council meeting was packed once again, and as David stood before them, he felt a sense of confidence he hadn't had before. He wasn't just fighting for his own home anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been silenced by the HOA. Karen stood up again, trying to present her usual arguments, but David could see that she was rattled. The evidence was undeniable, and the council members were beginning to see through her carefully constructed facade. "This isn't just about a few trash cans," David said, his voice steady and strong. "This is about a pattern of behavior that has been harming our neighborhood for years. We've gathered the evidence, and we won't stop until the HOA is held accountable for their actions." The room grew silent as the council members reviewed the evidence. David could see the tide turning. The HOA had no way to wiggle out of this one. The truth was too powerful to ignore. After a tense few moments, Mrs. Whitaker stood up, addressing the room with authority. "Based on the evidence presented, we will be conducting a full audit of the HOA's practices. We will investigate their actions and hold them accountable for any illegal activities. The appeal is hereby rejected." David couldn't help but smile as the room erupted into applause. The fight wasn't over, but this was a huge victory. The HOA had been exposed for what they were, and David and his neighbors had won. They had taken back control of their neighborhood. As David walked out of the town hall, he looked around at his neighbors, their faces filled with relief and hope. Together, they had stood up to the HOA and made their voices heard. It was just the beginning of a new chapter for the neighborhood, a chapter where they would no longer live in fear of the HOA's control. David knew the fight wasn't over, but for the first time, he felt like they were on the winning side. They had made it through the hardest part, and now they could finally breathe. The HOA had underestimated them, and now they were going to face the consequences. David smiled, knowing that this victory was just the beginning.